Thank you very much for having me, first of all. My name is Charlotte. I'm a PhD student at Karlove and at Maastricht University. I do research on how lying can impact memory, and specifically I look at false denial lies and how they can impact memory and memory errors for trauma-related events. So that said, there we go. I'm going to first explain what false denials are. So false denials are lies in which people claim that something did not happen, or that they didn't do something, or they didn't experience something, which in fact they did. And while maybe lies where you make up an alibi or you come up with a different detail seem more intuitive, in the first place, a survey by one of my colleagues, Paul Rieshaus, last year actually showed that false denials are some of the most frequently used lies in the general public. And we know that they're also very important in a legal context. So for example, perpetrators of crimes use false denials in a legal setting to try to evade culpability by claiming that they didn't commit a crime when in fact they did. Or also victims of abuse sometimes use false denials as a way to either cope with the overwhelming negative emotion of an experience, or because they're being threatened by a perpetrator not to come forward about something. So they might claim that something did not happen when in fact it did. We know that these people who use false denials, the perpetrators or victims, might eventually come forward with the truth. And then an important question is how these initial lies, so these denials, how they might have impacted their memory for the event and their testimony that they give in a court setting, for example. And in the past, we have already looked at memory effects of false denials, and this is usually done in a simple paradigm where first we ask participants to watch a video, or they're exposed to a stimulus in a different way. And then they engage in a conversation with an interviewer in which we ask them whether they remember, for example, that someone stole something in the video, or that something else happened. And half of the participants here would usually be instructed to falsely deny that certain details happened. So they're asked in advance not to reveal that, for example, anything was stolen or that any crime took place, whereas the other half of the participants would be asked to respond honestly. And after a delay, they engage in a memory test where we ask them about both their memory for the conversation, but also their memory for the video, to look at how these lies impacted their memory for the events and their memory for the time point at which they lied. And the most robust finding that we have here usually is the denial-induced forgetting effect, which has shown that denials or false denials can undermine memory for this conversation during which people lie. And specifically, participants who falsely deny seem to forget details that they lied about or that they discussed in this conversation. And sometimes we also find this effect for the video itself or for the original events that they lie about. So sometimes we find that false denials can lead to forgetting of details that were experienced or that were witnessed. But here the research is a little bit more mixed. We also know that, for example, in a setting where we imagine that a victim of abuse is denying that something happened, but there is for example, some corroborative evidence that in these types of interviews, it's possible that interviewers will use more suggestive techniques than they otherwise might. And we know that such suggestion can lead to false memories. And that doesn't mean that these are techniques that should be used, of course, but they might be. And false memories are memories for events or entire or details that never actually happened. And because it's especially likely that when interviewers are faced with denial, they might use such suggestive techniques, we want to look at what impact false denials could have on forgetting and on false memory endorsement from a victim perspective. So when we look at victims, for example, who deny that certain events happened to them. There's different theoretical considerations that might make us lead to different hypotheses on how false denials or these types of lies might be related to memory distortions or false memories. The first is fuzzy trace theory. And fuzzy trace theory basically is a theory that is oftentimes used to explain how false memories come about. And this theory holds that our memories are stored or encoded in two separate traces, a gist trace, which stores more the underlying meaning of an experience, and a verbatim trace, which really stores the specific details related to an experience. And according to fuzzy trace theory, false memories are more likely to arise when we have to rely on just information and recalling an event. The reason for that is that if you're relying on more the general meaning of an experience or this gist, it's more likely that you try to fill in the blanks of your memory by using false details, for example, that someone else has told you about. The idea with false denials is that if false denials lead to forgetting of specific details that were discussed or specific details that are part of the event, it's possible that participants who falsely deny will have to rely more on just information than these specific details that they have forgotten more than participants who are honest, which means that they might be more likely to form false memories. On the other hand, there's other false memory theories that will lead to different predictions, such as, for example, associative activation theory. And this is a theory that basically holds that memory works more like a network of interconnected knowledge nodes. So basically, when you're experiencing an event, then specific concepts in your mind will be activated that are related to this experience you're having. And in this memory network, activation will spread to other related nodes. However, it is possible that then nodes are activated which are actually not part of the experience. And that can lead to the encoding of a false memory. The idea is that if false denials lead to forgetting and specifically to inhibition of memories in the system or of nodes in this memory system, that then the spreading of activation would be reduced or inhibited, which means that there would be less false memories actually for people who falsely deny compared to people who are honest. And these are the two opposing hypotheses that we wanted to look at in the study. The design we used was a between subjects design with the lying condition as the between subjects factor. So we asked half the participants to falsely deny and the other half to be honest, which I'll get into in a little bit. We ran a power analysis. The specifics for this are in the pre-registration, but also in the paper. It's open access, published already. So it can be accessed there as well. But basically, we needed 128 participants. We recruited 189, but not everyone completed all sessions, and some people had to be excluded. So we ended up with a final sample of 127 participants. We used undergraduate students for the sample. And this is basically what the study looked like. So we first asked participants in a first session, which was done online because it was conducted during COVID, to role play a child sexual abuse narrative. So I know this sounds a bit strange, but I'm going to explain it a little bit more. So basically, of course, studying any sort of memory or anything from a victim perspective, especially related to this kind of crime, is very difficult ethically. But there is a paradigm called the stimulated memory era paradigm, which sort of makes this possible, where basically participants receive a narrative written from the second person perspective. So this narrative is written like you're waking up and you're going to have breakfast in the kitchen, and then you're meeting up with a friend, etc. And then you ask the participant to empathize being the main character in this narrative. So in this role, there's certain safeguards in place, such as excluding participants who say that they have experienced a traumatic event related to this, for example. But so the narrative that we used was comprised of two parts. And the first part, the main character, who was an 8-year-old child, was playing with her friend and spending the day with her friend. And then in the end, in the afternoon or evening, having a sleepover with his friend, where they were actually then abused by the brother of the friend. So that's sort of then the abuse-related portion of the narrative. So after empathizing with the main character of this narrative, participants were asked to engage in a police interview. So basically, this was a bit simulated, where we told participants that the police wanted to ask them about the day from the narrative that they just empathized with or spent reading. And half the participants were asked to respond honestly to all the questions about what happened during the day, but to deny that any abuse happened, whereas the other half was asked to just respond honestly to all questions that were asked by the police. After 1 week, participants came back for a second session in which we gave them some false information about what happened during the day in the narrative. And this came from the friend who was present during the entire day of the narrative and the nights. So we gave some false information about what happened in the narrative during the day, but also at nights when the abuse happened. And then we asked them to engage in a source memory test where we asked them both about what they remembered from the interview and what they remembered from the day from the narrative. And we also wanted to see how many of these false information details they would endorse, depending on whether they had denied the abuse or not during the police interview. And this is what we found. So I'm looking here first at true memory for the narrative. So what participants remembered happened during the day. The scores are shown in proportion. And first, it looks as though maybe there is a little bit of a denial-induced forgetting effect. So participants who denied seem to remember a bit less from the narrative compared to honest control participants, but this is not statistically significant. And as you can see, the differences are very, very small. And when looking at memory for the interview, we also don't find denial-induced forgetting. So the participants in both groups, so those who lied and who falsely denied, and those who were honest, remember about the same from the interview. So of course, this is a bit surprising to us because the effect has been quite robust, but there's two different possibilities for maybe why we didn't replicate this. The first being that it's the first time that we're looking at denial-induced forgetting from more a victim perspective, and someone who's empathizing from that point of view or from that perspective might be differentially engaged or refer the information more to themselves, maybe find it more important than someone who's just watching a video as an external person. On the other hand, it's the first time that we did this kind of research fully online. So the interview and the lying was done in writing rather than talking face-to-face with another person. And that could maybe impact the cognitive effects or the memory effects of lying. Of course, when we looked back at the two hypotheses for false memory generation, these were based on the premise that false denials would lead to forgetting. So then looking at this, we didn't necessarily expect to find an effect. However, when we looked at false memory for the narrative, we did find that participants in the false denial group had more false memories compared to participants who were honest. And this is a dot plot, meaning that each dot represents one participant. The white dots are participants in the false denial group. The black dots are those in the honest control group. And again, the scores are shown in proportions. So this is when we looked at both abuse-related and abuse-unrelated details together. We did split them up already as well. And we found that specifically this effect that participants who lied had more false memories for the narrative compared to participants who were honest was driven by false memories about abuse-unrelated events. So events that weren't related to the critical event itself, but just about what happened during the day. And this is, of course, forensically relevant as well, because it shows that even if someone maybe has lied about something that happened to them, the most critical aspects of the event seem to be not as affected by increased suggestibility as maybe more irrelevant events. And what we can take away from this research, for example, is that it seems unlikely that a victim of abuse actually forgets details of their experience after denying and after lying about it. Of course, we have to keep in mind that this is now one experiment and that we couldn't look at actual victims of abuse because there's obviously ethical constraints when we look at this type of research. However, we can also say that false denials and lies of false denials might lead to increased suggestibility and more false memories, but this seems to apply for most to abuse irrelevant information. So that someone who has denied that they experienced abuse, for example, might still remember the events related to the abuse itself quite well. Yeah, this is the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, you can ask, of course, and also I have the paper tag in case anyone wants to look it up.